Welcome to Let's Talk Climate. I'm Bruce Bekkar, fellow at Climate for Health at ecoAmerica, and I'm coming to you from northern San Diego on the coast, lands once shepherded by the Kumeyaay Indians. Since this month, May, is when we celebrate Mother's Day, and also it's Mental Health Awareness Month, we're going to talk about why protecting mothers and minds matters in a changing climate with our guest, Dr. Cathy Jordan. She's Director for Leadership and Education at the University of Minnesota Institute on the Environment, and she's Research Director of the Children and Nature Network. Let's get started. Cathy, it's so great to see you. Thank you for giving us a little bit of your time. How are you?
I am well. Thanks so much for having me.
You know, I think you and I have something in common. We're both rather fond of nature. How did that begin for you? Do you remember your origin story with falling in love with Mother Nature?
Well, certainly as a child, I have memories that, like lots of my childhood memories are about being in nature. I remember or interacting with natural elements. I remember things I did with my friends in our front yard. We would rake the fall leaves into the floor plan of a house, and that's how we would play house as little girls. We cleaned up the creek next to the golf course. We rode our bikes around a lot that we thought was huge, which actually was, when I went back 30 years later, was actually quite small. But all those memories from childhood are about being in nature. And, my career focus didn't get really zeroed in on nature until I was, well into my career and was doing a little bit of career rethinking or revisioning and realized that the thing that I was really passionate about in my personal life, which was my own children's obvious developmental leaps and bounds when they would come back from wilderness adventure trips or through their environmental education and nature-based learning at their school, I thought, this is a legitimate area of scholarly inquiry that I could really zero in on. And in about 2013 or so, I made a switch to really, really focus my career on kids and nature, and most recently have begun working more at the intersection of kids, nature, and climate here at the Institute on the Environment.
We're going to hear a lot more about that, and I'm eager to get into it. Also, though, I read about you that you are the type of person that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about in The Tipping Point. You're a connector. So is this something that occurred to you right away or at some point down the line in your career?
I think it's been an evolution, although there are threads. My first career as a pediatric neuropsychologist, I focused in on children who were experiencing lead poisoning and the impact of lead poisoning on the brain. And that was essentially, how can the environment be bad for kids' development? And the point was not lost on me that when I decided to, many years later, switch to this idea of children in nature, that it was essentially asking the same question, but turning the question on its head. How can nature, how can the environment be good for kids? So it all ties together, but it has been an evolution in my own head.
And you became a pediatric neuropsychologist.
My first career was as a pediatric neuropsychologist. So I went to graduate school to get a PhD in clinical psychology and specialized in working with children who had developmental disorders, neurological insults like lead poisoning, for example, and working with their parents in their schools on how to best serve them and guide them through their development. And I did that for about 10, 12 years or so, and then realized that you can make profound impact one patient at a time, but I also was having an experience doing some community-based participatory research on lead poisoning, which really got me involved more at the sort of systems level, policy level, community level, and realized that my brain sort of works at that level and that my gifts would be best served if I moved more into a role that was not a clinical patient care oriented role. And so then began a couple of different jobs at the University of Minnesota and with the National Children and Nature Network that are looking at those issues more at that scale, sort of way, as opposed to a patient caregiver interaction.
So interesting how many of us in the climate movement have come from varied backgrounds, but we have commonalities. I fell in love with nature. My parents took us to the beach a lot when I was a kid growing up, and I just fell in love with the ocean and being on the coast. And I went into medicine as an OBGYN and transitioned from patient care in 2013. I guess we probably got the same email or something. And I've been working from the system side and advocacy side around climate since 2013 full time. So, and again, it's great to have you, and it's so fascinating to get to know how your background ends up with you being where you are today. But that's what I want to get into, because our topic today is really a dual one. It's both mothers and minds. So what do we know from research about how climate change impacts people and their mental health especially? And what does that look like for children's mental health in particular?
So I think we can really talk about four major climate change phenomena: rising temperatures, rising levels of carbon dioxide, more extreme weather, and rising sea levels. Those are sort of the big four impacts of climate change. And these each have impacts that affect us as humans. Things like extreme heat, other severe weather events, air pollution, changes to the balance within ecosystems, increasing allergens in our environment or in our air, poor air quality, poor water quality, impact on food and water supplies, and environmental degradation. And each of those, I do think has a human impact. A lot of them directly or at least indirectly affect mental health as one of those outcomes. So for example, anyone who suffers from allergies knows that in addition to making you feel just lousy, it does have a mental health impact. It causes problems with irritability and sort of managing your emotions. You tend to have a shorter fuse. Your whole body is just a little bit ramped up and irritable. You might have to stay inside during allergy season, and that being cooped up like that does have an impact on our sense of happiness and and well-being. And we can just generally feel tired because of allergies, either because of the allergy or because of the medication. And that's also, while it's a physical feeling, it does also have an emotional impact. Heat is another really important one. A heat wave also affects our mental health, in addition to being dangerous, for our physical health, like, cardiac functioning, for example. But it makes us low energy. It also makes us irritable. Crime rates go up in heat waves. That's a great marker of, how heat is affecting our emotions and our behavior. And again, we may need to shut ourselves inside in the air conditioning, which can affect our happiness. As well as things like not being able to get out and exercise, which exercise is another tie-in to mental health. We tend to be more happy, more positive mood when we're also more physically active. A couple of major mental health impacts, more on the level of like acute trauma or even chronic levels of stress, come from severe weather events and environmental degradation. So severe weather like thunderstorm, really bad thunderstorms, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes. These things can result in everything from a fear reaction or a panic reaction to a tragedy, death of a loved one, or the annihilation of your community, your neighborhood. That clearly is going to trigger grief and loss reactions and fear reactions. Environmental degradation is it's a slower moving process than something like a tornado or a hurricane and its immediate aftermath, but it also has major mental health impacts. That might look like growing feelings of despair and loss from seeing the natural environment and places that you feel loved towards or connected to begin to change or begin to be destroyed. In some parts of the world, it also results in things like forced migration and seeking a more livable environment by fleeing your home, or civil unrest, civil conflict over things like diminishing resources. So it can have some pretty profound impacts on individuals and on societies, but all kind of tied back to essentially an emotional behavioral response. You've done some work, though, with birth outcomes that are tied to climate change. I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, thank you. And you did mention the two exposures that we studied. We got to talk about this actually. If anyone is on the YouTube channel, ecoAmerica's YouTube channel, later on, you can look back to the first episode in May 2020 of Let's Talk Climate. We got a chance to talk about some of the data that we had uncovered looking at the association of heat and two types of air pollution, fine particulates and ozone, on bad birth outcomes, specifically preterm birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth. We focused on those exposures because they're very common and were getting to be pretty well studied in the US. And those birth outcomes were common outcomes that were studied in association with those exposures. So we wanted to see if there was any sign of a consistent connection between those. And what we found out, and this was published in our JAMA study back in June of 2020, was that there were, out of 68 studies, 57 either on heat or these air pollutants that showed a very strong statistical association with those bad birth outcomes. And it turns out that that research has been strongly reinforced since our paper came out. Back then, we had 68 studies, over 32 million births. The mean number of births per study was over 500,000. So they were, by and large, really large studies. And again, the associations were very strong. We also presented other evidence based on animal studies or just the understandings that have been gained about how air pollution or heat might trigger a preterm birth or cause a low birth weight baby or even lead to a stillbirth. So there was biological plausibility to those associations. And then, as I say, since that time, there have been a number of studies that have come out from all around the world that look at those same outcomes and exposures and generally speaking, reinforced what we found. So we're not calling it cause and effect yet, but we're very tempted to get there soon because, again, there's just mounting evidence from multiple studies. And in addition, there's strong reason to believe that these things are connected from what we understand physiologically. Like, for instance, air pollutants, ozone and fine particulates are known to be associated with systemic inflammation and something called endothelial dysfunction, where blood vessels spasm and don't work right, and something called oxidative stress. There are studies that show that mothers exposed to high temperatures generally have smaller placentas than mothers that don't. And in a way that makes sense, since we know that there's when people are hot, their blood flow is redistributed more to their skin to give off heat, to help cool them off, which robs blood from the placenta. So not surprisingly, these placentas seem to be smaller. So again, there's mounting evidence on both sides, both of the consistency of these findings, almost no matter where you look, and also the physiologic mechanisms that are underpinning them. It all seems to be coming into a clearer focus. I just want to mention a couple of studies in particular that people may want to look at. There was a big review that came out in November of 2020 in the British Medical Journal from an author by the name of Matthew Chersich and his group. They looked at we looked at purely US populations, but they looked at 70 studies in 27 countries, most of which were medium or high income countries. And not only did they find significant evidence of high temperatures being associated with those same kind of bad birth outcomes, but they're actually able to, because it's a meta-analysis, begin to quantify what those risks were. And this is still, I would have to say, preliminary. But for instance, for each 1 degree centigrade higher temperature recorded during pregnancy, there was a 5% increased risk of both preterm birth and stillbirth per 1 degree. In heat waves, a 16% increased risk. Studies looking at low birth weight, there wasn't the same high degree of agreement, 18 out of 28 studies, and a relatively small amount of weight loss noted, but still a pretty consistent finding. But they also reinforced another really important factor that we found in a lot of our studies on air pollution in particular, that outcomes were worse for women of low socioeconomic status and women of racial minority, Black moms in particular. It was another review that was published in February of this year from Sandy Ha at University of California, further reinforced our findings, and interestingly was looking to see whether there was consistency in when the most vulnerable times were during pregnancy to avoid heat exposure. And unfortunately, what she found in all the studies that Sandy looked at was that almost no matter what time of pregnancy, everything from first trimester through the third, up to the week before delivery, that there was a strong suggestion that heat exposure was bad for preterm birth risk. So she ended up concluding that both acute and chronic exposures are relevant. We do see more consistent findings for heat risk during the warm season. And that just makes sense because temperatures are higher. It looks like stillbirth, the sensitivity time period appears to be either very early in pregnancy in the first trimester, setting up a stillbirth later on, or in the week of the fetal demise. Again, the baby doesn't pass immediately when a stillbirth occurs. It usually takes a few days. And it looks like being exposed to a heat wave is risky in terms of stillbirth risk at the time that the baby dies. She also noted the association with lower socioeconomic status and higher risk, and also extreme so-called maternal age, mothers that are under 20 or over 40 in general. Looking at air pollutants, wildfires looked like they produce a particularly noxious and toxic mix of PM 2.5. It looks like second and third trimester are the most vulnerable windows. So I would say that overall what's happened since our paper came out is we're seeing more studies in agreement around the world, really, and we're beginning to bring into focus the populations that are most at risk and also the time periods in pregnancy where those exposures are most dangerous. So this information is all really important, and we're going to pivot, I think, in this discussion to talking more about solutions, what can be done about these findings. And so I want to come back to you, Cathy. What would you say that we know about how nature impacts people and especially children?
Yeah, I think nature is a really important issue to think about with respect to climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And at Children in Nature Network, we talk about, and first let me just say something about Children in Nature Network in case folks don't know what that is. There's a link in the chat leading you to that organization and some resources that we put out about the impacts of connecting kids to nature. But Children in Nature Network is a national, maybe you could argue international nonprofit started about 15 years ago by Richard Louv, who wrote the book Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. And it is a backbone organization. It's not a deliverer of programs, nature-based programs for children, but it really is working at the level of systems and policies and changing practice in different sectors to make sure that kids and families and communities have access to quality nature and the kinds of programming opportunities or educational opportunities or even healthcare opportunities to engage with nature in ways that are going to be most impactful for them. At Children in Nature Network, we talk about nature making children healthier, happier, smarter, and better stewards of the environment. And that's kind of communication speak. And I want to break that down a little bit and talk about what do we mean by those words? What do we know from the research? So healthier, we can think about in terms of nature engagement really offering opportunities for physical activity and physical fitness, and in the case of things like gardening, improved nutrition, and therefore prevention of childhood and adult chronic disease development, things like diabetes and heart disease, things that are dependent on physical conditioning and nutrition issues. Happier is all about those things related to mental health. When we are in nature, we tend to experience more positive mood and less negative mood. We tend to feel less stressed. Nature-based programs like wilderness adventure or nature-based education programs often offer opportunities to practice and grow social emotional skills, and offer opportunities to build resilience and adaptability. You know, nature is full of little risks and challenges, and you need to sort of, you know, figure out, can I do this? I can do this. If I bite off a little piece of it at a time, and you grow in your confidence, and you tackle those challenges, and the next time you face that challenge, it's easier, and you realize, yeah, I made it last time, I'm going to make it this time, and that builds up some resilience. Smarter, you know, we initially thought about smarter really in terms of like learning and academic functioning and educational outcomes, and the support for learning of cognitive functions like attention, for example. There's lots of evidence that suggests that when we're in nature, we are resting parts of our brain that are responsible for effortful attention. And then when we need to go back into a situation like work or a classroom or something like that, where we need to direct our attention and, you know, be very focused, we're refreshed. You know, we've sort of recharged. So that may be a mechanism between nature and learning outcomes and educational outcomes. But then, you know, we also started seeing some studies that made us think, wow, actually, smarter is not really a misnomer. We used to think, well, nature doesn't actually increase your IQ. Well, actually, there is a study that does show that children who grow up in greener environments do have higher IQ scores. Not causal study by any means, can't do that, but there is a relationship or a correlation there. And we even have imaging studies that show that kids who grow up in greener environments, closer to parks, more tree canopy, you know, those sorts of things, they actually have structural differences in their brain, where parts of their brain are sort of, you know, bigger and healthier and stronger, that control some of these functions like attention. So nature really can contribute to building a better brain and higher intelligence, making us smarter. And then that last area, better stewards. You know, the old sort of traditional environmental education model was about delivering environmental information about issues and solutions. You know, if people just knew, they would act. And we now know that that's not true. That's not really how people work. And there's, it's really a strong connection to nature, emotional connection to nature, that undergirds it all. Nature connection shifts our attitudes towards being more pro-environmental. That attitude opens us up to receive that environmental information and solution-focused information. And then we're in a position to act and engage in some sort of environmental behavior. But there's many steps involved there, and strong connection to nature is step one. One other thing I wanted to mention about what we know from the research is an emerging finding that I think is really relevant to something you just talked about, Bruce, in terms of the findings related to pregnancy and birth outcomes being relatively more significant for lower socioeconomic status women. We do know that all sorts of impacts related to climate affect people who are from disadvantaged communities or experience other sorts of marginalization. They are affected more so. And what is interesting is that if we think about nature as an antidote in a way, there's research that suggests that nature exposure, simply nature exposure, greenery around you, but also participation in nature-based programming and education and those sorts of things, the impact of that on all sorts of different outcomes is stronger for lower socioeconomic status kids and families. And that is true also of birth outcomes of pregnant women who are, you know, residing in more green environments. So it really, I think, gives us a window into what we need to think about systemically and policy-wise, and, you know, where we put our energy, our care, our dollars. We can get a lot of bang for the buck if we target nature-based interventions for those who are most at risk, because it really will help us at least begin to narrow some of those opportunity gaps, achievement gaps, health disparities, things like that.
You touched on so many things that I could comment on, but I will tell you that my moment of awakening around climate change was all about the risk to nature and rising sea levels and damage to the coastline. I got there well before I got to the link to health. That was back in 2007. And so I certainly resonate with that. And I also have done a little bit of reading about the impact of nature and physical activity on creativity. Functional MRI studies showing, as you say, different brain function when we get exposed in those ways. And it made me even think that perhaps it's just the fact that we weren't actually designed to be sitting at a desk and only moving our hands for 8 hours a day, that we have spent the great majority of our existence on this planet up and moving in nature. And so when we go out, because I thought about it because of how many times I've been out for a run, and halfway through the run, I will solve a problem without even trying to. Something will occur to me. And it got me thinking, maybe we almost have a carpal tunnel syndrome going on with just flogging our prefrontal cortex all day long. But when you get out into nature, all of your brain starts to fire in an integrated way, kind of the way that it was designed. And lo and behold, it's a problem solver. It works better. It fires up our creativity. It infuses us with joy. So anyway,
Yeah, absolutely.
we had an extra hour.
I know we could really riff on that, but I do think that the theories that underlie why is nature good for people, which are mostly around attention restoration, which I talked about a little bit, stress reduction, which is really also connected. One's sort of a more physiological and one's a more cognitive look at it. And then the biophilia hypothesis, which is that we are sort of innately, genetically, evolutionarily programmed to be connected to nature. All sort of speaks to what you're talking about, that we, in recent decades or maybe even centuries, have really pulled away from the way we were built to be. And we are suffering some of the consequences of that. And as a result, we're not as resilient as we could be in the face of climate change. And we can talk more about nature and climate now, if you like.
Well, I do want to stop momentarily for a question from Dana, who asked, I think when you were talking about the studies that show improved intelligence in kids that get into nature a lot, Dana wanted to know, is that controlling for socioeconomic status and other markers of disparities? Did they take those into account?
So was this, I want to make sure that I understand, was this in response to what I described as, I didn't name it this, but it's called the echogenic effect, this idea that nature is relatively more impactful?
Just, I think you were talking about how exposure to nature or being out in nature, there was a correlation with improved intelligence.
Oh, I see. Yes. Oh, intelligence. Sorry, I didn't realize that. Yes, all of these studies, researchers do a pretty good job now of controlling for socioeconomic markers, sometimes better than others, but yes, that is controlling for socioeconomic status.
Okay, great. So how can nature be part of the solution-focused strategies around climate change in particular?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of different ways to think about this, and I want to make three distinctions by way of making 3 points in response to that question. So in my world at the Institute on the Environment, we often talk about nature-based solutions around climate change that are really geared to helping us combat climate change itself. And these are things like planting trees helps us sink carbon, incredibly important in our fight against climate change. It's also important for things like the urban heat island effect. The more trees we plant, the more greenery we have around us, we are creating more shade, and there can be like an 11-degree difference in one part of the city that has no trees and a part of the city that is well shaded. And that could mean a life or death, difference there for vulnerable populations. Um, it could also be things like, mangroves, helping to prevent flooding on the coast as a result of storms. So nature-based solutions are when we use a natural thing like trees or mangroves or whatever as a way of either mitigating or adapting to climate. But then I want to make the distinction, that nature-based solution versus nature as a resource directly for people around health and well-being and resilience and coping in the face of climate change. And that's a little bit different. Here nature is helping the humans who are affected by climate change. And I think the next two distinctions I want to make will sort of tease that apart a little bit in terms of how nature really helps humans in the face of climate change. So one distinction is about prevention versus intervention. So nature as a preventive, we could say a natural resource, a buffer. We might even say it's a social determinant of health. And we can also say that nature is an intervention around something that's already happened. So when there are ample opportunities for engaging in nature, one outcome might be the development of resilience. I talked about that earlier with regard to kids, doing outdoor activities that provide them certainly the emotional benefit, but also challenging them in ways that build up their resilience and their adaptability. That resilience can translate into being able to navigate future climate-induced emotional responses or traumas. With regard to nature as an intervention, when we address our stress, or we seek to lift our mood by getting into nature as a way of coping with stress and maybe feelings of despair as a result of climate change, that's effectively using nature as an intervention to cope with climate change. So I hope that distinction is clear. Nature in our environment and also the way that we get into nature is protective for us. But also once we've experienced that emotional response or that trauma, or even a physical condition, it can be therapeutic after the effect as well. And then the next distinction I want to make is the role of nature around us, like that ambient greenery idea versus the role of actively engaging with nature directly. And both are really critical for our health, for our well-being, our mental health, in both that prevention and intervention sort of way. Living or going to school in a green neighborhood with access to parks, to good tree canopy, greenery within the view of kids' classrooms, things like that. It's important for everything from mitigating the urban heat island effect in cities or around schools to decreasing our stress levels that have implications for all sorts of things related to health and learning. But I think actively engaging in nature activities sort of steps it up even a little bit more. Being around greenery is really critical, but being in nature and really immersing yourself is really important for the cognitive functioning, the social emotional functioning, and all of the physical benefits that I mentioned before. And all of those benefits, I think, really are ways that we can maintain some health and resilience in the face of climate change. So this is part of how humans adapt to a changing climate. And it's how do we keep ourselves healthy? How do we be strong, emotionally and physically in the face of challenging environmental conditions?
And I want to throw in a shout out to the architects that are doing work around LEED certification, because it's sort of a way of bringing the outdoors indoors. People, I understand, and you probably know much more about this, but there is some evidence that working in a LEED certified building that has a lot of good ventilation and natural light, the people that work in those buildings actually call in sick less than people working in buildings that are not good, that are dark and fluorescent lit and oppressive to be in. I know I was a Kaiser Permanente physician for a number of years, and we've been ahead of the curve in creating office buildings and hospitals that are LEED certified. And it is glorious being in those buildings. It's fundamentally different than the ones I started in. Because of all that light and good air, I think there's hope for the built environment then, I guess, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when you design interiors and views of the exterior with greenery and nature connection and mental health in mind, you can really make some profound change in people's experiences that include their work productivity and their longevity in a job, but also just their overall well-being. Mhm.
I want to continue along that hope theme, and we're starting to run a little short on time, but I did want to mention I spoke a little bit about the risks to birth outcomes from heat exposure and air pollution. Um, and so the question that generates, I think, that follows pretty naturally is, well, what do we do now? Uh, there was a study in 2018 from Joan Casey and her group looking at preterm birth rates near 8 fossil fuel burning power plants in California that were closed. And they looked at preterm birth rates over the next 10 years after the closure of those power plants. And certainly, I think you can infer that when you stop spewing those gases on a 24-hour basis from these power plants, that the air quality probably improved markedly around those areas. And so the mothers living close to those power plants, the preterm birth rate went down over the next 10 years by 27%. And I can tell you as an OBGYN that that's a major reduction in preterm birth risk. And what it says to me are two things. First of all, it helps to reinforce that air pollution had something to do with preterm birth in those neighborhoods, because taking it away, you saw that very significant reduction in risk, but also that the benefits that we're going to get by switching to renewables and moving away from fossil fuels have benefits that we're going to see far sooner than turning down the temperature from climate change. We're going to see those health benefits almost immediately, which I think is really important for us to think about as we move towards the systems change that we need, that the benefits are available to us in terms of health pretty quickly. I also want to mention that one of the other things that's happened in the last couple of years, now that we've elevated pregnant mothers and their newborns as a vulnerable group to climate's impacts on health, is that the resources and the understanding of how to counsel patients to reduce their risks are also maturing and proliferating. There's something called the Climate Psychiatry Alliance that recently put out a whole bunch of really nice handouts for patients about how to reduce their risk to heat and there are others that have been put out around air pollutants. But certainly we as providers need to remember that some of our patients live in urban heat islands, as you were describing, where they face much warmer temperatures than other people in surrounding neighborhoods. And being proactive about, because we generally know a few days in advance, at least, when there's a heat wave coming, for all the vulnerable groups, pregnant mothers and the elderly and the poor and people with chronic health conditions and mental health histories, it would do well to be proactive about avoiding a heat wave as much as they can, going to spend time in cooling centers or libraries or the mall, theaters, places where they can get out of the heat, making sure that they hydrate a bit more aggressively during those times. And the same can be done. There are a number of apps now that you can monitor your air pollutant exposure on a daily basis and your allergen exposure, as you were talking about. And so there are ways that we can be more proactive, both as providers and also for members of the family, in watching out for these exposures and minimizing them, because we'll all feel better. So there is a true evolution. And I think the last part to put into that is indoor air pollution is also a significant factor in terms of health risk. And we're learning that stoves that burn gas can be replaced. I love my induction cooktop. but also so-called natural gas heaters are a big source of indoor air pollution. And these things, there are getting to be more and more workarounds and replacements for them that are not only much better for our health and climate, but also probably better for our budget too, because those costs are coming down. So I think there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic. And we are getting close to our time limit. I do want to make sure we get to this question though with you, Cathy. How should we talk about climate change with children?
Mm. Yeah, that is super important. I'm going to, hopefully my links will work here. I'm going to drop a couple of resources in the chat. Good, looks like they did link there. I think the first thing is to figure out, when kids ask about climate, what are they really asking? Are they asking for information, or are they asking for emotional support? Parents know their kids the best. They can, try to tease that apart a little bit. They can, use the language that's most developmentally appropriate for their child's level, and that they, language that won't trigger, sort of an alarm or a despair reaction. But really thinking about, like, if the child wants information, it's important to provide that information about what climate change is, what it's caused by, but at a level that kids can understand. And with younger kids, parents can really reassure kids that, this is a problem that like smart people are working on, and they will be, taken care of by the adults around them, and that we as a family, can do something about this. And you can do that in sort of age appropriate ways. Younger children, in the home, you might focus on things like, recycling, or, turning off the lights when you're not using them. Older students are capable of thinking beyond the home to being involved in their community, might be with classmates, or, might be a youth climate march, or, something like that, or donating their allowance. If they want emotional support, it's always important to validate emotions, no matter how old the child is, and assure them that they're not alone in feeling that way. The younger the child is, the more that you can, help them feel comforted by the adults around them. Older kids might not buy that. They have some legitimate anger about the role that adults have played in climate change. The second thing, I think, is to really focus on hope, but realistic hope. Talking about climate change can be scary, it can be despair-inducing, and it's really important to focus on what's possible, and to have hope for achieving those possibilities. So communicating, realistic hope is hope that is not Pollyannish, doesn't try to deny the challenges or sweep the risks under the rug, but rather it's based on reasonable expectations. And this actually leads me very closely into a tie-in with efficacy and agency. Nothing will improve if we believe that we can't make a difference. To make a difference, we need a vision. We need to have that hope for what can change realistically. How it can change, we need to understand how to address it, and how we can contribute. And we need to believe that we have the capacity to act, self-efficacy, and that if we act, we can make a difference. Something will change, and we call that agency. I guess the fourth thing I would say is that compassion is really important. Climate change, as we mentioned, affects different people differently. Some of our most vulnerable citizens are hit the hardest, either because they're the oldest or the youngest or the most medically in danger, or they're otherwise marginalized in their communities or don't have access to safer environments. And they have fewer resources to cope or to change their situation. So if age appropriate, it would be good to weave into conversations with kids some understanding that this is all in a context of the widespread and ubiquitous inequities that we face in our society. And then, even though I'm saying this last, it's actually the foundation, and that is connectedness to nature. No one is going to care about climate, about environmental issues, unless they feel a meaningful connection to the natural world, to our earth, And that connection, it can happen at any age, but we really have a window of opportunity in childhood, beginning at the very youngest ages, to make that connection. And that really sets the stage for everything else. So in summary, it's important to focus on the truth, but in language that's, developmentally and emotionally appropriate for the child, that they can understand, that's going to manage their concern and their outright anxiety, and language that gives them a way to act. That act piece is really important, because what we want to do is we want to focus on hope, solutions, and how kids, however old they are, how they can make a difference in impactful ways.
There's a lot there. Thank you so much. We have time for one final question. We're actually running very short, and I'm not going to necessarily be able to do it justice, but David asked, basically, they have 2 kids, they're thinking about having a third, and they are hesitating because of concerns about where our climate crisis is taking us. And I'll say 2 things. First of all, David, I'm going to recommend this as a topic for a whole episode of Let's Talk Climate, because your concern is shared by many people. And there's actually a movement in this country to not have kids, specifically because of what we're facing with climate and all the other kind of related issues. And so, again, we're not going to be able to do a thorough job answering that in 30 seconds. But I guess what I would say is, regardless of how you come down on this question, I think we have to remember that there are reasons for hope out there. We are hearing about the uptake of renewable energy around the world happening much faster than was ever predicted. And that keeps getting recalibrated year after year, because we keep exceeding even last year's expectations. And there are other signs like electric vehicle sales and new technologies coming along. So we have to be careful not to think about the risks that we're going to face in 10 or 20 years, just armed with the solutions we have today, because we will have more 6 months from now, much less 5, 10 years from now. So regardless of where you come down on this answer, I would never begin as an obstetrician to point anybody into a yes or no answer here. I would hope that you use the information that you get from Cathy and other experts to know that you have ways to talk to your kids about these risks and the problems that we're facing. And also maybe to turn them around and say that we have tremendous opportunities to solve all kinds of long overdue issues in our society, like racial injustice and environmental injustice and healthcare outcome disparities. There's so many things that are wrapped up with climate that we can so-called multi-solve as we approach them all. And I'm personally optimistic about the future. I know that many people are grappling with things that are maybe that we've ignored for too long, and that we're making progress in many areas. And I expect that will continue to grow. But anyway, thank you so much for the question. And that does conclude our time today. But I have to thank you, Cathy, for inspiring everyone here and everyone who will watch this to prioritize bold climate thinking and solutions to help improve the health of ourselves and our families.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
It was fabulous. Engage with us online with the hashtag Let's Talk Climate, all one word, and be sure to subscribe and follow us for the latest thought leadership, resources, and episodes on climate action and advocacy. From everybody at ecoAmerica and Climate for Health, thank you for being here. Please join us in caring for our climate in order to care for our health. Please be well, stay safe, and take action. Thank you.